The problem, though, is if we use that gratitude or that, kind of perspective as a way of suppressing our own pain, anytime we suppress our own pain and we avoid it, it actually makes them more intense.
You're such an idiot. You should know better. You're not good enough. Who do you think you are? No, these are not words told to me by my arch enemy, but the words told to me by my wonderful negative voice. And well, I am assuming I'm not the only person who has this kind of self-dialogue that plays on repeat like a broken record. I think many of us are tuned into the same radio station. And let's be honest, the DJ is just kind of mean. And now, while we're all social distancing, we have more time to listen. The volume is on max. In fact, it's playing in surround sound. Dolby surround sound. The negative loop just keeps on playing, and you can't change the frickin' channel. Yep, it's stuck on Beat Yourself Up FM. So today I wanted to bring on an expert, and I figured a professor of educational psychology is just the right person. But she's not only a woman who has spent years researching and understanding self-compassion. She herself had to practice what she preached after her son was diagnosed with autism in 2007. Facing the most challenging time in her life, she found herself using her own self-compassion practices to steer clear of anger and self-pity in times of stress and despair that would inevitably come for her. And so she is here today to teach us the tactics and strategies we too can use, especially in this time of hardship. So guys, please help me in welcoming the author of Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself, a speaker, expert, and co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion program taught by thousands of teachers worldwide. So guys, if you want to change that station that is airing the negative playlist, well, she is the battery to your remote controls. A true pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, the ever-compassionate Kristin Neff.
Hello.
Welcome to the show, girl. I came across in my research of you a quote that you said, and this is exactly where I want to start because it was so powerful. Self-compassion has been shown to be one of the most powerful sources of strength, coping, and resilience we have going for us. When the going gets tough, the tough get self-compassionate. So I love that quote so much. But what I want to talk about is really starting with what's the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion, and why now have we as in you with all your research has discovered that actually self-compassion is the key.
Right. So self-esteem is basically a positive judgment of self-worth. It's like summing yourself up and deciding whether or not you're a good, worthy person or you're a bad, unworthy person, right? And self-esteem often comes from social comparison, right? So in other words, we have to be special and above average to have high self-esteem. It's not okay to be average. In fact, we feel insulted if someone tells us we're average. And so what that means is, well, first of all, it's logically impossible for us all to be above average at the same time. But what that means is we're constantly comparing ourselves with others. There's kind of a hidden bias to try to see ourselves as better than others and to subtly put others down. We see someone walk in the room. Is he smarter than me? Is she prettier than me? Is he more successful than me? And that social comparison, it creates a distance between ourselves and others. And it can lead to things like, for instance, bullying. Why do kids start to bully in early adolescence? To get higher self-esteem, right? When you're a young teenager, you don't have a lot to go on. So maybe if I pick on that weird, nerdy kid and other kids look up to me for being the strong, cool kid, maybe I'll feel good about myself, right? And then in adulthood, it takes different forms. So prejudice, for instance. Prejudice is complicated. It's not just about self-esteem. Part of it's just plain power. But at least part of it is the fact that we like to feel that our ethnic group, our gender group, our political group, our religious group is better than others so that we can feel good about ourselves. So that need to feel better than others, that's a part of self-esteem, is not very healthy. The other thing that's really not that healthy about self-esteem is that it tends to be contingent. In other words, it depends on success. It depends on whether I'm as attractive as I want to be. And actually, for a woman, that's the number one domain in which we invest our self-esteem, attractiveness, right? So it has the biggest impact on our self-esteem. Other things like success at business or athletics, if that's important to you. And also how popular we are, right? A lot of our sense of self-worth comes from what other people think of us. And by the way, it's not what your mom or your best friends who give you. They don't count. You take them for granted. It's what other people, like other kids at school, other people at work, other people in the Facebook social media milieu who give us likes. And the bad thing about that is we don't know them, what they really think of us, and they don't know us, who we really are. So, in other words, the sources of our self-esteem are often very poor, and they're often problematic. Now, there's nothing wrong with having high self-esteem, and it's much better to think well of yourself than to hate yourself. The problem is, how do we get that self-esteem? And so usually the sources aren't that healthy. That's where self-compassion comes in. So self-compassion is not a judgment or an evaluation of being a good or a bad person, of being a worthy or an unworthy person. Self-compassion is simply being kind to ourselves because we hurt like all human beings hurt, right? We're imperfect human beings. We've got good sides. We have bad sides. We have good days. We have bad days. And because we're human beings who struggle, we give ourselves the same type of compassion that we would show to any human being who is struggling, right? So it's not about judgments or evaluation. We just kind of embrace this whole mess. We don't try not to be a mess. We embrace this whole mess with kindness and support and kind of unconditional care and worthiness. And that's why we have self-compassion. So just to say, self-compassion does give you self-esteem. So if you're self-compassionate, you're going to have higher self-esteem than if you slam yourself with self-criticism and shame all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The source of self-worth is not conditional, right? It's not like it's always there, especially when I fail. I mean, self-esteem is a fair weather friend, right? It's there for you in the good times. It deserts you in the bad times. Self-compassion is there precisely when you fail, you make a mistake, something really difficult happens in your life, like this pandemic, right? This is precisely when self-compassion steps in to support us when times are bad. And so not only is it not contingent, it's not comparative. You don't have to be better than anyone else to have self-compassion. You just have to be a flawed, imperfect human being like everyone else. Well, I could do that. You know what I mean? So you might say that self-compassion is a healthy source of self-worth. But again, it's not just feelings of worthiness. It's really actively supporting ourselves, asking ourselves, what do I need in this moment to care for myself? And so self-compassion is concerned with the alleviation of our own suffering in the same way that we might naturally be concerned with alleviation of those we care about, their suffering.
Wow, that's so amazing, because here's the thing. I've done many shows, over 100 now, and I'm always talking about self-esteem. I'm always talking about that I had low self-esteem when I was a kid. I was bullied as a kid. I was teased as a kid. And how have I built up my self-esteem? And it's never occurred to me with self-compassion on the difference and how fragile self-esteem is, whether, I love what you said, right? You can either succeed or fail, and self-compassion will always be there. But self-esteem, when you fail, you just feel crappy about yourself.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So thank you for breaking those up. That's really clear. Now I want to talk about how do we develop self-compassion and what are the traps in going into this? Because I'm always like, okay, what serves me? How do I improve? Okay, self-compassion, amazing. But then there's also going to be traps in the self-compassion game. So for instance, an example is, how do you differentiate between pity and self-compassion? I think you even said you don't want to suppress, but you also don't want to exaggerate. So, so talk to me about that and how we navigate that.
Yeah, and so they aren't really traps of self-compassion. What it is there are things that some people might confuse with self-compassion, and they may think they're being self-compassionate when they really aren't. And in fact, there are strong cultural myths about self-compassion. Our society doesn't teach us to be self-compassionate, partly because we're afraid all these bad things are going to happen. All of them are, not only are they untrue, research shows the exact opposite is true.
Tell me a couple of myths. Can you give me some examples?
People are afraid it's going to be self-pity. People are afraid it's going to be selfish. People are afraid it's going to lead to complacency or laziness, undermine your motivation, or self-indulgence. So these myths come up again and again, and we really think, oh, if I'm self-compassionate, these bad things are going to happen. But that's because it's not really self-compassion. There are other things that maybe look like self-compassion, but that's not what we're talking about. So let's start with self-pity, right? So self-pity is not healthy. But what is self-pity? Self-pity is woe is me, poor me. It's very isolating. So the way I define self-compassion is it's three main components. The first is mindfulness. We're kind of aware of our struggles in a kind of balanced way. Like you said, we don't avoid or suppress it. We don't run away with it. There's some perspective, some wisdom there. Kindness, which I talked about, but also common humanity. This is actually what differentiates compassion from pity. So compassion in the Latin means to suffer with. There's an inherent connectedness. If I have compassion for you, you're going to enjoy that experience because I'm feeling connected to you in your struggle. If I pity you, you're not going to want me to pity you because I'll be looking down on you. I'll be putting myself above you. And it's the same thing with self-compassion, right? So self-pity is woe is me. Self-compassion is, hey, life's difficult for everyone. Everyone's imperfect. It's not just me. In fact, quite the opposite. I can feel connected to others in my struggles. You know, whether it's the pandemic. I mean, this is one instance where we don't fall into the illusion of thinking it's just me because we can't, like literally the whole entire world. But typically we do. Like typically it's not rational, but we tend to think, you know, it's just me who has cancer, or it's just me who was dumped by our boyfriend, or it's just me who said that thing at the party, right? We forget that, wait a second, humans do this all the time. And so with self-compassion, we remember our humanity, we remember our connectedness to others as we relate to our own pain. And that gives us a buffer, and it also helps us feel empowered, because when we feel all alone, we feel weak, we feel frightened, right? We feel like separated from others. But when we remember, hey, this is part of being human, like even this pandemic, right? It's horrible, but you know, and sure, it's incredibly difficult. But this isn't unusual in human history, right? Pandemics happen. And so if we go too far down the line and this isn't supposed to be happening, you know, why is this happening? This isn't supposed to be happening. It's like, well, you know, who said it's not supposed to be happening? You know, these things happen. So, and what that does is when we accept that it's part of the human experience, is instead of fighting against it and railing against it and saying this should not be happening, and when we say this should not be happening, it's like we're banging our head against the wall. You know, not only does it hurt, we feel extra frustration because we think it's not supposed to be happening. But when we remember, well, this is part of the human experience. And then, so what can I do to help myself? What can I do to help others? How can I work with it as opposed to just, you know, railing against it, which actually usually doesn't help very much.
Yeah, that's so true. And there's something that you said, and I actually want to link that to something you said at the beginning, which is don't compare yourself. So one thing that I know that is instinctual that a lot of my friends and people that I know in the mindset space do is they compare themselves to make the situation better. So for instance, they're like, well, yes, I may have lost my job, but at least I'm not starving like other people in the world. Like they say it as a way to empower themselves to make them feel better. But you actually said at the beginning that comparing yourself can be dangerous. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, and so it's both, right? So on the one hand, it is useful to remember that some people have it worse off. That's just wisdom. That's perspective, right? And so we need that perspective. So, you know, for instance, I'm suffering because of the pandemic like everyone, but yet, you know, I'm so grateful I have a job and I have a home, and many people have it so much worse. And that's important that we be grateful for what we have. The problem, though, is if we use that gratitude or that, you know, kind of perspective as a way of suppressing our own pain, anytime we suppress our own pain and we avoid it, it actually makes it more intense, right? And so when we accept our negative emotions, when we accept the fact that it's difficult, it actually makes it less intense. That's just the way the human brain works. And so if you use even gratitude practice as a way to suppress your negative emotions, it's actually not going to work because you're suppressing them, and eventually they'll just come out that much stronger. And so both are true. And from my point of view, and from the point of view of compassion, any moment of suffering is worthy of a compassionate response. It's not like you've got to suffer a certain amount in order to earn compassion. You know, if you stub your toe, for instance, tiny little moment of suffering, but think about it. If you stub your toe and get really reactive and get really angry, you might kick your cat or kick your child. So even that moment, you say, "Oh, just that slight kindness, even for something as insignificant as stubbing your toe, will put you in the state of mind to where you aren't so reactive, and actually you might be able to, be more productive in that moment." So all suffering is worthy of compassion, large or small. But all suffering is not the same. It's also important that we acknowledge that as well.
Right, that our reactions are not the same. So if you stub your toe versus you lose your job, understanding that the reaction isn't going to be the same, and you don't want to elevate your stubbing the toe to be reactionary, like the world is crumbling.
Right, yeah, and so much of it is how we react to what's happening, right? So again, sometimes we overreact, sometimes we underreact, right? So really there are 3 steps of self-compassion which correspond to the 3 components. First, we need to be mindful of what's happening. We have to be aware that it hurts, validate it, acknowledge it. And again, it doesn't matter if it's big or small. Any moment of suffering is here, right? So acknowledge that this hurts, whatever it is. And then remember that this is part of life, right? So it's not just you. We want to de-emphasize that sense of separate self. So often our ego runs with the storyline of how horrible it is. And when our ego runs amok, then things get a lot worse. So, and ironically, even though it's called self-compassion, it actually lessens the sense of separate self. It just frames everything as, well, this is part of the human experience. And as we do that, there is some wisdom in seeing that, while some people have it harder than I do, it doesn't mean that my pain doesn't matter. But yes, it's wise to remember that we have a lot to be grateful for. And then bringing in the kindness, right? So then we bring in warmth and support and care, just like we would for a friend we cared about, or a child, or a loved one. And when we do that, when we're kind to ourselves and we meet our emotional needs, when we meet our physical and psychological needs, then we have a lot more resources to give to others. And that's why some people think self-compassion is selfish. It absolutely is not selfish. Because if you give and you give and you give and you beat yourself up, you're going to burn out and you're going to have nothing left to give others, right? And I'm not just talking about if I do yoga and I eat well. I mean, self-care is important. But in the moment, like, so when you're caring for someone who's struggling, if you're hurting because you're caring for them, like you're feeling overwhelmed, you're feeling exhausted. I mean, a lot of parents right now, right? Their kids are home, driving them batty,
Mm-hmm.
And so acknowledging the difficulty of that and saying, this is really hard. I feel so overwhelmed. I feel, I don't have time to work. This is really hard. And kind of being kind to yourself. I often recommend like physical touch as a way of supporting yourself. Any word you might say to a friend, hey, hang in there. I've got your back, that type of thing. The more you do that, not only the more resources will you have to care for your kids, but when you are with your kids, or when you're with your spouse, or when you're with your elderly parent, whoever you're caring for, they are interacting with someone who's calm and kind on the inside, right? As opposed to someone who's stressed and full of anger on the inside. Because we read each other's emotions constantly. Our brains are designed to do that. We have mirror neurons whose whole function it is to feel what other people are feeling. So what we cultivate internally is what we present to the world, is what everyone else interacts with. So the idea that somehow self-compassion is selfish and other compassion is not selfish doesn't make sense, because self and other, we're constantly in interaction where my mind state impacts your mind state impacts my mind state. So the more peace and love and connection and warmth I can cultivate internally, that I bring that out into the world with me.
God, that was so amazing. Oh my God, I loved how you just broke that down. There's so much I want to talk about. So one thing that you mentioned actually is that it being selfish, right? But what's interesting is if I was to be compassionate to somebody else, or let's say I wasn't compassionate to somebody else, people were like, oh my God, what a bitch. Like, she wasn't compassionate to her. But yet, if I'm giving it to myself, it is perceived as being selfish, which, by the way, the word selfish for me, I don't see as a negative. I think we have wrapped negativity around that word. But like you said, and I know it's now become cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. Put your freaking oxygen mask on yourself first before you try and save others, right? Like, it's so true. And yet, if we are trying to take care of ourselves first by showing self-compassion, it's perceived as selfish. That's crazy to me.
But we do need balance. I mean, that's the whole thing. So self-compassion isn't at the expense of other compassion.
Right.
So it's always like, what's the right balance, And that's going to change from moment to moment. There are times as a parent when you have to, give 95% of your attention and energy to your child. There are also times as a parent when you need to give 95% of your attention and energy to yourself. Right? Or sometimes it's 50-50. And so that's why we also need wisdom. We need wisdom to be able to see, what are the needs in this situation and to make a wise choice. But if somehow we exclude ourselves because we think it's selfish or we think it's self-pity, or actually we haven't even talked about this one, if we think it's going to demotivate ourselves, which is totally untrue, then we aren't being wise, and then we aren't going to be able to help others as much as we would otherwise.
Where does that thinking come from?
I think there's a few reasons. I think there are some actual physiological reasons for why we tend to be harder on ourselves than those we care about. So what happens is when we're threatened, we go into the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? We know that's our oldest. That's like the reptilian brain. It's our oldest, most easily triggered nervous system reaction. And the system is great for when a lion's chasing you, but what happens when you're threatened because you look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, or you failed your exam, or, something happened? The threat is actually ourself. The threat is to our ego, our self-concept. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we turn the fight, flight, or freeze response inward, and we attack ourselves, thinking that somehow if we attack ourselves, we'll be able to control the situation and be safe, or be able to change ourselves and be safe. Or, we hide in shame, thinking that we hide in shame, then we'll be safe from others, right? Or we freeze in rumination, again, thinking we're going to be safe. And so because of this desire for safety, we more quickly and easily do fight, flight, or freeze with ourselves than if you fail or make a mistake, I'm not so threatened by it.
Interesting.
I have more space to tap into my other safety system, which is the tend and befriend system, right? They call it the mammalian care system. There's a lot of different names, but that's when we feel safe by closeness, by physical touch, by caring for others, having them care for us, bonding, social bonding. This is something that mammals have that reptiles don't, but it's not as quickly and easily triggered. It takes a little more time. Takes a little more space, actually. We aren't always so compassionate to our nearest and dearest, like our partners or our kids, because they're so close. We're fused with them, and when they fail or something happens to them, we feel threatened, and that's why sometimes we're more reactive with them. Whereas a good friend, you aren't so threatened, right? So some of it is the level of threat, and then a lot of it is just social conditioning. We are raised, as you say, to be compassionate to others. But, kind of the Puritan ethic, at least in Western cultures, teaches us that we're supposed to be self-critical. We're supposed to be hard on ourselves. We don't want to spoil ourselves or be selfish. And so we get a lot of unhealthy cultural messages that also stand in the way, I believe.
Yeah. Ooh, you're just dropping bombs here, girl. This is so amazing. Okay, now where I want to go, you've done an amazing job of explaining self-compassion, breaking it down, how it can hurt us, how it can help us. And the one thing is, as you were talking earlier, you put your hand on your chest and your heart. And I've heard you talk about touching yourself as a way of for you to be self-compassionate. Talk to me about that and then the studies behind it. Because here's the thing, I used to think it was woo-woo. I used to think it was totally woo-woo, and I just felt silly. One time I tried it when I was stressed, and I was like, "It's okay, Lisa," and I'm like, "This feels freaking weird." But when I understand why, I can lean into it so much. So if you can enlighten me on that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so again, it just goes back to the nervous system and basic physiology. So, like I said, the mammalian care system for mammals, the way we signal care is through touch, right? And so for all animals, all mammals, they signal care through touch. Think of a mother cat cuddling with their kittens, or dogs through touch. But humans as well, right? So for the first 2 years of life, humans don't have language. And so the way parents and children communicate care and safety and warmth is through touch. And so our bodies are exquisitely designed to respond to touch as a signal of care. And so what happens when we put our hands on our heart or our stomach or face, if you washed your hands, or any touch, it actually calms down our physiology, right? It reduces our cortisol levels. We feel relaxed. We don't have data connecting these dots, but it's likely reduces oxytocin and opiates, which are associated with this parasympathetic nervous system reaction. It increases heart rate variability. And so basically what's happening is you're communicating to your body it's safe and care is present. And the reason it's so useful is because sometimes just mentally we can't go there. We're too full of the storyline of how bad we are or how bad the situation is. And so calming down our physiology can actually help. It helps change our physiology so we're less activated with cortisol, et cetera. It also works kind of almost at a pre-conscious level. It's not working with fear, it's kind of working at the bodily level, which helps. And that combined with things like understanding, warm tone of voice, caring message, it really strengthens it. And we often tell people to kind of drop out of their head into their body, because our head is where the storyline is and where we go off into the catastrophe and you're just off to the races. But our bodies are right here and right now, so our bodies are present, they're grounded, they kind of help stabilize us. And so we might tell people if they're really upset about something, just feel your feet on the floor. So feeling your feet on the floor, grounding yourself in your body. And of course, with touch, it also helps remind us of our physical presence, which also helps ground and stabilize us. And so that's why in many ways it is touchy-feely on purpose. But it really, really works. But, some people, if it really doesn't work for some people, there's no reason you have to use it. It's just useful.
Yeah, it seems so obvious when you say it, girl. But like when I heard you say in the first 2 years, a child can't talk, it can't understand. So all it has is touch and scent. I was like, oh my God, of course. Like that makes so much sense. And so it really did fit like a puzzle piece when you said that. Of why it makes a difference. So I'm going to go a little tactical and ask you a couple of questions here on just like, are you better off trying to get a cuddle or touch from somebody else, or does it have to be yourself? And then the reason why I ask is I think of like massages and when you're tickling, like you can't really tickle yourself. And when you give your massage, you don't feel as relaxed. So in my head, I'm just going, okay, is that the optimal way of doing it? Or should I be getting other people or hugging a teddy or something like that?
Right. I think it really just depends on what works, right? What works and what's available in the moment. Right? So it's not like self-touch is more effective than a loving hug from someone you care about. I mean, that's very effective. If hugging a teddy works for you, then that's good as well. Or my friend, she has 4 dogs. Mm-hmm. That's her oxytocin rush. So I don't think it really matters so much. The reason the self-touch is useful, though, is because we do know it's from ourselves. So in other words, let's say I get a hug from my friend, and maybe I know my friend loves me, and that's very, very important. But if my friend loves me, but I don't love myself, and I think, oh, of course my friend thinks of that. I mean, she's my friend, but it's not really true. So we may undermine the messages of support we get from others and acceptance. And also, our friends may not always be there. I mean, in the middle of the night at 3 a.m, when we wake up and our heads are full of the storyline, sometimes it's only us who's there in that moment. And again, it's not to replace other people. Of course, we need other people, but we don't want to be wholly dependent on other people. Mm. So we really need to include ourselves in the picture.
Yeah, that's so true. Another tip that I've heard you say is to refer to yourself when talking about your emotions in the second person.
It's right. I mean, it again, it depends what works. Each individual is different, but it can be really effective because when you say you, I sometimes use terms of endearment for myself because I'm a mother and I always call my son darling and sweetheart. So I'll say darling and sweetheart to myself. For some people, that's going to make them gag, and if that's your reaction, don't do it. But for some people for whom terms of endearment are very natural and feel warm and supportive, they can be really effective. What happens when you say you is, first of all, you've got some distance. So when it's I am feeling so upset, it's like it's easier to be lost in the feelings of being upset. Whereas when you say, wow, you're really feeling upset, darling, it's like immediately you've got some perspective. You're like stepping outside of yourself so you aren't so fused with the difficult emotions, right? And also we're more familiar with giving compassion to someone else. And many of us are compassion experts, just giving it to someone else. So we know what to say to our friend. We know how to address our friend. We know the tone of voice to use. We know the types of supportive, kind, warm things to say. Or let's say some people had a very loving, caring grandparent. Then they might think of, well, what would grandma say to me right now? It's still coming from oneself. For some people, it helps to hear it from another person, like a third person, like a grandparent or a spiritual teacher. I mean, for people who are really religious, for instance, they might think, what would Jesus say? I mean, that's a type of self-compassion, right? From my point of view. So, I think it's really whatever works for you.
I love that. And what I love is in listening to you and all your research and your tips, it's like there is a list of things that people typically say, and then there's things that you have brought to the table that it just didn't even occur to me, right? So like I didn't even think about ever referring or thinking about it in a second person. So when I heard you say it, I was like, but why? And then you break it down. I'm like, oh my God, that's freaking genius. Now look, I love getting tips. I love hearing them, understanding them, and then trying them. And like you said, once you try them, you have to assess if it actually works for you or not.
But you say you aren't used to referring to yourself in the second person, but what about when you fail? I mean, we often say, oh, you idiot, right? So we're very used to doing it in that context.
That's interesting.
So we're more used to that voice. So we're just kind of changing that.
And that's what's so fascinating, right? Is that we become so, it's just habitual. Like it's so common for us to be thinking like that. Like it literally never even dawned on me. You're 100% right. I love that you pointed that out. That's amazing. One thing that I always find fascinating is like the loop, the cycle that you go in. So you don't have self-compassion. How do you not beat yourself up about not having self-compassion, right? And then because in that beating yourself up, I think it pushes you out of being able to be self-compassionate.
Yeah, well, I think it does really help to remember that self-criticism comes from the desire to be safe. I mean, that's why we do it, right? There's some part of us that feels threatened. We feel insecure about something. We really think that by being hard on ourselves, that we'll help ourselves, right? It's kind of misdirected care, you might say. Maybe our history is we were criticized by our parents. And so if we criticize ourselves first, we could save ourselves the pain of being criticized by our parents or being criticized by society or losing our job or whatever the thing is we're afraid of. And so I think once you really understand that the reason we're so hard on ourselves comes from the desire to be safe, then we can kind of have compassion for inner criticism as well, and then we can say, okay, if I just want to be safe, well, it's probably a more effective way to be safe. And that's by caring for myself, because that's also a way to stay safe, but it doesn't have all the negative side effects like anxiety and shame and, activating your nervous system so much that you can't think straight, depression. I mean, shame and depression are not exactly the most helpful mind states for changing yourself, right? But love, support, encouragement, they're much more effective for making the changes you need. And the number one block to self-compassion is people really think that self-criticism is an effective motivator of change, right? That people really believe that they need to be hard on themselves to make the changes they need to be safe and happy. right? And what they don't realize is that it kind of works. It's kind of like that coal-powered steam engine that gets you up the hill, but it spits out so much smoke that it causes a lot of problems, right? And what the problems it causes is it undermines your self-confidence. If you criticize yourself a lot, confidence is a very important factor in being able to reach your goals. Makes you afraid of failure, also, which inhibits your motivation. It leads to things like procrastination because you don't want to beat yourself up if you fail. You can just give up eventually because you stop believing in yourself. And it also causes performance anxiety, which undermines your ability to do your best. So compassionate motivation, it's like you don't motivate yourself because you're afraid you'll be inadequate if you don't reach your goals. You motivate yourself because you love yourself and you want to reach your goals because you care. So it's just as motivating, but you're unafraid of failure because, well, if you fail, then you can say, oh, what can I learn from this failure? So it leads to kind of a growth mindset, less performance anxiety, a less fear of failure. And when you do fail, you're more likely to pick yourself up and try again. So it's actually a much healthier and more sustainable form of motivation than self-criticism. But people don't know that because they've never tried it.
That is so freaking strong. And the reason why that resonated with me so much is I talk a lot about, so as we were building Quest, I was just grinding. I was the negative voice. Come on, Lisa, stop being lazy, get your ass up. You failed. All right. What have you got? Right. Like that would be my internal dialogue. And I do believe it was part of what got me my success, because when I fell, I gave myself such a hard time. Like, get up. Like, and I wasn't talking nicely to myself. But it forced me to get up. It forced me to keep going, but I didn't feel good about myself at all. And I ended up crashing and burning, and my health at the height of my success, my health completely plummeted. So I've really been struggling with what advice do I give to people when it comes to that, because I really did believe that it was part of my success.
Yeah. So a lot of people get through law school and med school and they do achieve with self-criticism. Again, it does get you up the hill, but it spits out so much black smoke that it actually is unhealthy. And so what you can do is, if you think about how you might motivate a child. So for instance, my son Rowan, he had been homeschooled, and when I finally sent him to public school, the very first test he took, world geography, he failed, flat out F. And I could have tried to motivate him with, that approach, the critical approach, which would be like, oh, come on, Rowan, get yourself together. You're a failure. That's not good enough. You do better. It's like, what would I have done to him? He probably would have maybe he would have studied, but he probably would have, had so much anxiety, would have failed this test, maybe would have dropped out of world geography. So what I did, the first thing I did was I gave him a hug. I said, hey, I'm so sorry. Oh, man, that hurts to fail. Hey, it's okay. It happens to everyone. So I made him know that even though he failed his world geography test, I still loved him. But did I leave it there? Would I be a compassionate parent if I just left it there?
Yeah.
I don't want him to fail out of his classes. So, what I did? I called his teachers. I figured out what was going on with the study routine. We helped him figure out how to study better, and now he's doing much better. And so, in other words, the motivation comes from care, right? So when we care about ourselves, we want to reach our goals. And so love is a very powerful motivating force. If we think of the love parents have for their children, we see the power of love as a motivator. Parents will do anything for their children. They'll give up their lives for their children. And so actually we start to develop that sense of commitment to ourselves. And it can be a very powerful motivator. And like I said, what it really does is it enables us to look at our failures much more openly, and we learn a lot more from our failures. And that also helps us succeed.
Man, the one thing I love that you talk about a lot that I've noticed is perspective, because the perspective is, I definitely would have thought of somebody as being a bad mum if they were just like mean to their kids about like, you failure, get your ass up, what are you made of? Clearly nothing, like, I'll be like, man, that's just like a mean parent. But that's absolutely the voice that I used to talk to myself. So I love that reframing, because it really did bother me that got me partly to my success. And I don't want to advise it. And so you've just given me amazing words on how to get to that same result, but using kind and compassion towards it.
And by the way, sometimes, the kindness has to be a little fierce. I call it like mama bear self-compassion, right? So there's like mama, like, oh, it's okay, sweetheart, the soothing, which is sometimes needed, that kind of accepting ourselves as we are. And sometimes it's like, hey, this isn't working out. You need to leave this relationship. But it's not because you're bad. It's because I care about you. You need to leave the relationship now. It can be like really firm or saying no, drawing boundaries. So it's not always soft, this voice. It can be very fierce and protective. But the goal, the aim is always our health and well-being, and that's what makes it compassion, even though the form it takes actually may look quite different depending on the circumstance.
Yeah. I've heard you say that people from abusive families are typically way less compassionate, self-compassionate. Why is that? That was shocking to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense because if, the system that was supposed to make us feel safe and cared for, which is our parents, our attachment system, if it didn't make us feel safe, it made us feel unsafe, then actually the experience of compassion itself can be scary, right? Because if I'm kind to myself, it might remind myself of my parents who weren't kind to me, and it actually make me feel scared, right? And so we call that backdraft. It's like people their whole lives, they've had to shut down the doors of their heart just to survive. And then they start opening up the doors of their heart. It's like the love rushes in and the pain rushes out. And it's kind of like a fire, house on fire. If you throw open the doors of a house, the air rushes in, the flames rush out. That can happen. It's actually a good sign. It's not a bad sign. It means the healing process has begun. And so we can actually reparent ourselves in a way. Some people call self-compassion a type of reparenting ourselves. So we give ourselves what we need. We meet our own needs consistently. We give ourselves the unconditional love that maybe we didn't get as children. And that actually helps us heal as adults. And it's a really useful way to actually heal from past abuse. So it's not like where it's set in stone and we can never change. We absolutely can change. Again, we may need to go more slowly, and it really helps to have some therapy or professional help on the journey.
Yeah, understanding that really, I think, does help. Because I didn't actually get the whole backdraft thing. And when you explained it, I was like, oh God, yeah, that makes complete sense. And I love that you actually ended it on, but it actually is a good thing. So even, opening your heart up, even if there's a backdraft,
that's right,
is the right way to go.
It's the right way. But just sometimes you don't want to fling, firefighters, the reason they carry those picks is they go around the perimeter of the house and they poke holes in it to let the air in more slowly. And so sometimes, maybe it's too much to say, I love you, darling. That makes you scared, but you might just pet your cat or something, do something nice for yourself or have a cup of tea, which is a smaller act of self-kindness that isn't so destabilizing. And then you just kind of work your way slowly.
Oh, woman, you're freaking awesome. I could just keep asking you questions all day. But I will ask you my final question, what is your superpower? If it isn't obvious already.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I open my talks with a picture of Wonder Woman or Superman. And self-compassion, I know, because it is a superpower. I mean, and it's like these magic powers. And the thing is, we have it available to us. It's in our back pocket. We have this incredible resource of kindness, of support, of encouragement, of warmth, of care, of love, and we don't use it. It's like we use it for others, but we don't use it for ourselves. And it's right here. And the thing is, it's quite sad that we don't use it because it is so easy and it's so readily available. The nice thing is, though, is that it's not rocket science to learn self-compassion because you already know how to do it toward someone else. You've already figured out how to be compassionate. It's one of the skills you've learned as a human being. So all you have to do is give yourself permission to use your superpower and use it with yourself. And it does feel awkward at first. You've got to get over it. It's a learning curve. But it's actually not nearly as hard as you might think it is.
Dude, that was one of my favorite answers ever of what your superpower is. That so resonated with me. Where can people find your book and follow you and see all the good stuff you're doing?
Probably the easiest thing is just Google self-compassion. You'll find my webpage, and on the webpage you can test your own self-compassion level. I've guided meditations, I have practices, I have a ton of research. If you're a research nerd, you can sign up for my newsletter, and you can also take trainings like from the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. You can take online trainings if you want to learn more. So there's a lot of resources available.
Amazing. And we'll put the links in the show notes as well. Guys, she's freaking amazing. Go follow her. Go check out her book. If you're not following me, follow me at Lisa Bilyeu and click that subscribe button. If this episode brought you value, please do like, share, and comment. And until next time, use self-compassion and be the hero of your own life. Till next time, guys. Peace out.
What up guys, Lisa here. Thanks so much for watching this episode. And if you haven't already subscribed, click that little button right in front of you. Click away. We release episodes every Wednesday, so be sure to get notified. Till next time, go be the hero of your own life.